Nobody exists on purpose. Nobody belongs anywhere. Everybody's gonna die. Come watch TV. Remember when Morty said these surprisingly profound words to Summer? That moment marked a turning point in his character evolution, one of many we'll explore tonight. From his first OG's Rick to becoming a hardened survivor who occasionally outsmarts his genius grandfather, Morty's transformation is one of the most fascinating character arcs in modern animation. As you get comfortable, we'll begin our chronological journey through every significant Morty moment across all 6 seasons. Have you ever wondered what Morty was like before he became the complex character we know today? His journey begins much simpler than you might remember. When we first meet Morty Smith in the pilot episode, he's the definition of a nervous 14-year-old. His stuttering voice cracks with anxiety as he's yanked from his bed in the middle of the night by his grandfather Rick, who's drunk and rambling about some grand adventure. Morty doesn't question or resist. He simply follows along, eyes wide with a mixture of fear and reluctant curiosity. The pilot immediately establishes the power dynamic that would define their early relationship. Rick is the domineering genius, while Morty is essentially his helpless assistant. When Rick crashes his spaceship and declares they need to go to another dimension for medicine, Morty doesn't have any say in the matter. He just nervously tags along, constantly reacting to the chaos around him rather than making any decisions of his own. One of the most telling moments comes when Rick reveals that their adventure has a hidden purpose: smuggling valuable mega seeds back to Earth. The way Rick casually asks Morty to hide these seeds by putting them way up inside himself reveals how little regard Rick has for Morty's comfort or dignity. And Morty's reluctant compliance, despite his obvious distress, shows just how desperate he is for his grandfather's approval. He's willing to endure physical and emotional discomfort simply to be included in Rick's world. The early episodes repeatedly highlight Morty's naivety. When confronted with alien customs or strange new worlds, he relies entirely on Rick's guidance. His moral compass is still developing, and he hasn't yet learned to question Rick's often dubious ethics. This creates a fascinating foundation for his character. We're watching someone whose entire worldview is being shaped by possibly the worst mentor imaginable. In these early adventures, Rick doesn't even pretend that Morty has value beyond being a convenient tool. In Close Encounters of the Rick Kind, Rick explicitly tells Morty that his only purpose is to act as a human shield, whose brainwaves can camouflage Rick's genius from detection. This revelation hits Morty hard. Learning that you're essentially just walking camouflage isn't great for a teenager's already fragile self-esteem. What's particularly interesting about early Morty is his relationship with death and violence. The pilot throws him into situations where he has to run for his life, yet he somehow maintains his innocence. When he breaks his legs during their escape, and Rick calmly discusses the possibility of replacing him with another Morty from an alternate dimension, we see the seeds being planted for his later existential crises. These casual brushes with death and disposability form the foundation of the trauma that will eventually shape him. Within his family dynamic, Morty occupies a painfully overlooked position. His father, Jerry, sees him as a disappointing reflection of his own inadequacies. His mother, Beth, is too busy dealing with her own issues to give him much attention. Even his sister, Summer, dismisses him as a loser. No one in the household seems to believe Morty has much potential, creating a vacuum that Rick, despite his terrible influence, fills by at least acknowledging Morty's existence. There's a particularly revealing scene in the pilot where Jerry confronts Rick about Morty missing school. Rick dismisses formal education entirely, claiming that Morty's adventures with him are more educational than school could ever be. While Rick's motives are self-serving, this moment establishes that Rick is the only adult in Morty's life who sees any kind of potential in him, even if that potential is just as a useful accessory. The early episodes also show glimpses of Morty's innate kindness, which stands in stark contrast to Rick's callousness. When faced with alien life forms or strange situations, Morty's instinct is usually compassion and understanding, while Rick's is exploitation or indifference. This contrast establishes the moral tension that will drive many of their future adventures. By the end of the first few episodes, we see a Morty who's beginning to change under Rick's influence. He's still fundamentally the same nervous teenager, but his experiences have started to plant seeds of resilience and skepticism. He's witnessed things most humans never will: the vastness of the multiverse, the relativity of morality across dimensions, and the statistical insignificance of any single reality. These concepts are too big for his young mind to fully process, but they're reshaping him nonetheless. What makes early Morty so compelling is the dramatic irony of his situation. We, as viewers, can see how Rick's influence is simultaneously broadening Morty's horizons while potentially damaging him. Morty himself doesn't have this perspective yet. He's just trying to survive each adventure while maintaining some sense of normalcy in his teenage life. The beauty of these early episodes is how they establish Morty as a blank slate, someone whose character will be defined by how he responds to extraordinary circumstances. His initial traits of nervousness, compliance, and desperate need for approval create the perfect starting point for what will become one of animation's most interesting character evolutions. It's worth noting that even in these early adventures, Morty occasionally shows flashes of the person he'll eventually become. When pushed to his limits, he sometimes stands up to Rick or demonstrates unexpected resourcefulness. These moments are rare but significant, foreshadowing his growing independence and resilience in later seasons. Those rare moments of independence would be put to the ultimate test in what might be the darkest episode of Morty's early journey. Rick Potion number 9 isn't just another adventure. It's the exact moment where Morty's understanding of reality fractures irreparably, forcing him to confront the horrifying implications of living with Rick Sanchez. What started as a seemingly innocent request, Morty asking Rick for a love potion to use on his crush Jessica, spirals into catastrophe with frightening speed. When the potion interacts with a flu virus, it spreads globally, causing everyone except blood relatives to become obsessively attracted to Morty. Rick's attempts to fix the situation only make things exponentially worse, eventually transforming the entire human population into monstrous Cronenbergs, grotesque, inside-out mutations of humanity that render the Earth uninhabitable. The true weight of this episode lands when Rick casually reveals he can't actually solve the problem. For the first time, Morty faces a mistake that can't be undone, a reality that can't be saved. It's in this moment we see Morty's dawning horror as he processes what's happening. "What are we going to do? We can't just leave," he protests, showing a moral conscience Rick clearly lacks. The gravity of this realization, that Rick views entire universes as disposable, hits Morty like a physical blow. Rick's solution is both elegant and horrifying. They simply abandon their ruined dimension and jump to one where alternate versions of themselves solved the Cronenberg problem but died immediately afterward in a lab accident. In perhaps the show's most disturbing sequence, Morty is forced to help bury his own alternate self in the backyard. The image of Morty digging a grave for his doppelganger becomes a perfect visual metaphor for the death of his innocence. This burial scene represents more than just a practical solution to a body disposal problem. It's Morty literally burying his former self, the naive kid who believed in heroes and happy endings. As he shovels dirt onto his own face, we're watching him internalize a much darker understanding of the multiverse. Every shovelful of dirt represents another piece of his innocence being covered up, never to return. The psychological impact of this experience cannot be overstated. Imagine being 14 years old and not only witnessing the apocalyptic destruction of your entire world, but being partially responsible for it. Then, rather than facing consequences, you simply step into another version of your life, replacing yourself. The existential implications are staggering. If infinite realities exist, do any of our choices actually matter? If you can always find a reality where things worked out differently, what value does any specific reality hold? What makes this moment particularly significant is that it doesn't just traumatize Morty, it fundamentally alters his worldview. We begin to see the formation of a nihilistic philosophy that will later culminate in his famous "nobody exists on purpose, nobody belongs anywhere, everybody's gonna die" speech to Summer. The seeds of that outlook are planted here, in the soil of his alternate self's grave. The brilliance of Rick Potion number 9 lies in how it functions as both plot advancement and character development. Before this episode, Morty could always return home to normalcy after adventures. Now, home itself has become a lie. a place where he doesn't truly belong, surrounded by family members who aren't technically his original family. The sanctuary of normalcy is permanently stripped away. This experience creates a permanent fissure in Morty's psyche that the show references throughout later seasons. Creators have noted that this episode was crucial in establishing the emotional stakes of the series, forcing Morty to confront harsh multiverse realities. In quiet moments, we occasionally see Morty looking out the window toward the spot where he buried himself, a subtle reminder that this trauma continues to haunt him. What's particularly interesting is how Morty processes this trauma. Unlike Rick, who numbs himself with substances and cynicism, Morty begins developing a more complex moral framework. He starts questioning not just Rick's actions, but the entire system of thought that allows Rick to treat universes as disposable. This questioning becomes central to Morty's character development moving forward. The aftermath of abandoning his original dimension forces Morty to develop coping mechanisms for dealing with cosmic horror on an unprecedented scale. He can no longer hide behind ignorance or pretend the multiverse operates according to simple moral rules. Instead, he must construct a new understanding of reality that can accommodate the terrible knowledge he now possesses. This shift is visible in how Morty carries himself in subsequent episodes. There's a subtle but noticeable change in his demeanor, a new wariness, a reluctance to fully trust Rick's plans, and occasional glimpses of a darker worldview creeping in around the edges of his personality. The stammering, eternally nervous kid remains, but beneath that familiar exterior, something fundamental has changed. The lasting impact of Rick Potion number 9 creates ripple effects throughout the series. Whenever Morty makes a morally complex decision, the ghost of this experience looms in the background. His growing comfort with moral gray areas can be traced directly back to this moment when he learned that sometimes there are no good choices, only different flavors of terrible ones. What's particularly poignant about this turning point is how isolated Morty remains in processing it. He can't talk to his new family about what happened, since they have no awareness they're replacements. Rick refuses meaningful emotional conversations. Morty is left to process this cosmic trauma entirely alone, which explains much about his accelerated maturation in later seasons. While Morty's trauma from the Cronenberg disaster was transforming his view of existence, another remarkable change was quietly taking place beneath the surface. The isolation he experienced after abandoning his original reality created a unique paradox within him. As his perspective on the multiverse darkened, his sense of right and wrong paradoxically strengthened. It's as if witnessing the disposability of entire universes made him cling more desperately to the few moral certainties he could still identify. This emerging moral compass would first truly assert itself in Me Seeks and Destroy, an episode that represents a critical turning point in Morty's development. After countless adventures following Rick's lead, Morty makes an unprecedented demand. He wants to lead his own adventure for once. When Rick dismisses the idea, Morty doesn't back down, but instead proposes a bet. If Morty's adventure goes well, Rick will have to give up control on every 10th adventure moving forward. This seemingly small negotiation actually represents Morty's first significant challenge to Rick's authority, a brave assertion of independence that the old Morty would never have attempted. What makes this moment especially significant is how Rick responds, with mockery and absolute certainty that Morty will fail. The power dynamic between them has been so established that Rick can't conceive of Morty succeeding without him. Yet Morty persists, showing a newfound determination that suggests his experiences have given him the courage to stand his ground, even in the face of Rick's overwhelming personality. Morty's self-directed adventure takes them to a fantasy realm that initially seems whimsical and far less dangerous than Rick's typical excursions. But this fairy tale setting becomes the backdrop for one of the most disturbing moments in the series. A traumatic bathroom encounter with King Jellybean that tests Morty's emerging independence in ways he couldn't have anticipated. The bathroom scene with King Jellybean represents a deeply personal violation that forces Morty to confront trauma of an entirely different kind. Unlike the cosmic horrors he'd witnessed with Rick, this is an intimate, personal assault. The scene is handled with surprising sensitivity for an adult animated show, never played for laughs, but instead treated as the serious violation it is. We see Morty fighting back against his attacker and eventually escaping, traumatized but having defended himself without Rick's help. This horrific experience could have destroyed Morty's newfound confidence, but instead, it becomes a crucible that further forges his moral strength. Despite the assault, Morty chooses to continue the adventure rather than admit defeat to Rick. There's something profoundly moving about this decision. It shows that Morty's need to establish himself as more than just Rick's sidekick has become central to his identity, even in the face of personal trauma. What happens next reveals the evolving complexity in Rick and Morty's relationship. When they later encounter King Jellybean being celebrated as a beloved ruler, Rick notices Morty's discomfort but doesn't push for an explanation. As they leave the dimension, Rick silently destroys King Jellybean with a laser blast, never mentioning it to Morty, or taking credit for this act of protection. This moment of subtle defense shows the beginning of a more nuanced relationship. Rick is still not capable of direct emotional support, but he's developing a protective instinct toward Morty that goes beyond Morty's utility as a human shield. Following these events, we begin to see Morty more consistently questioning Rick's decisions, especially when innocent lives are at stake. The passive, constantly terrified boy from the pilot is evolving into someone who can identify moral boundaries, even if Rick routinely ignores them. While Rick operates on purely utilitarian principles, Morty increasingly serves as the voice asking, "But should we?" When Rick only considers, "Can we?" This moral development reaches another significant milestone in Close Rick Counters of the Rick Kind, when Morty witnesses something that fundamentally shakes his understanding of his place in the multiverse. At the Citadel, he discovers hundreds of other Mortys being exploited and mistreated by their Ricks, including a disturbing chamber where Mortys are being tortured to generate their brainwaves as camouflage. Morty is genuinely horrified by this revelation, and this experience deepens his understanding of the multiverse's moral complexities. The sight of exploitation on such a scale forces Morty to confront the uncomfortable truth that his relationship with Rick, problematic as it is, might actually be better than what many other Mortys experience. At the same time, it reinforces his growing conscience as he recognizes the inherent wrongness of how Ricks treat Mortys across the multiverse. This realization becomes a catalyst for his moral development, pushing him to increasingly question Rick's decisions and assert his own ethical boundaries. What makes Morty's moral evolution particularly compelling is that it doesn't happen in dramatic, decisive moments where he suddenly becomes righteous. Instead, it develops gradually through accumulated experiences, making it feel authentic and earned. With each questionable adventure and each time Rick crosses a line, Morty's discomfort grows more visible. He begins voicing objections more frequently, showing that he's no longer content to be a passive participant in Rick's chaos. The tension between Morty's growing conscience and Rick's utilitarian approach becomes central to their relationship moving forward. Rick, who views the multiverse as a playground with no meaningful consequences, since there are infinite realities, increasingly finds himself challenged by a Morty who insists that choices and actions still matter, even in an infinite cosmos. This philosophical conflict creates a fascinating dynamic, where Morty serves as a moral counterweight to Rick's nihilistic tendencies. Creator commentary has emphasized that this moral development is indeed a central theme in Morty's character arc. The writers have deliberately constructed his journey to involve grappling with the consequences of Rick's actions and finding his own voice in a chaotic multiverse. As Morty witnesses more of Rick's casual disregard for life, he doesn't become desensitized. Instead, he develops a stronger conviction about right and wrong, perhaps precisely because he's seen how easily those distinctions can be dismissed. That human shield Rick drags across dimensions isn't just developing ethics. He's revealing flashes of brilliance that challenge everything we thought we knew about his capabilities. Could Morty's supposedly inferior brainwaves actually be masking a different kind of genius that even Rick can't properly measure? Behind that anxious stammer and perpetual look of confusion, Morty Smith possesses a mind capable of surprising depth and adaptability. While Rick constantly labels him as an idiot, the evidence throughout the series tells a different story. Morty's intelligence doesn't manifest in the traditional academic sense that school systems value, nor does it present itself in Rick's manic scientific brilliance. Instead, it emerges in moments of pressure, ethical complexity, and interpersonal dynamics. The episode Morty Night Run provides one of the clearest examples of Morty's unique intellectual capabilities. When faced with the telepathic gaseous being known as fart, Morty demonstrates a level of moral reasoning that goes beyond simple black and white thinking. Despite Rick's practical insistence that keeping fart alive would be dangerous, Morty makes the complex decision to protect this entity, showing both emotional depth and ethical intelligence in weighing the value of a life against potential consequences. This wasn't just teenage rebellion. It was Morty processing multifaceted ethical variables and coming to his own reasoned conclusion. Even more impressive is Morty's scientific aptitude, which emerges gradually as he's exposed to Rick's inventions. In The Ricks Must Be Crazy, we see perhaps the most dramatic example of Morty's growing scientific understanding. When Rick creates a battery powered by an entire miniature universe, Morty not only comprehends the mind-bending concept of nested universes, but he applies this knowledge practically. The episode shows Morty grasping scientific principles that would overwhelm most adults, then using that understanding to navigate problems that Rick himself created. Morty doesn't just passively absorb information. He processes it and applies it in novel situations. What's particularly noteworthy about Morty's intelligence is how it complements Rick's weaknesses. While Rick is a scientific genius, he's consistently baffled by emotional dynamics and social cues that Morty navigates with increasing skill. This emotional intelligence allows Morty to understand people in ways that completely escape Rick's comprehension. In situations requiring empathy rather than equations, Morty often emerges as the more capable of the duo. We see this emotional intelligence on display in The Wedding Squanchers, where Morty demonstrates a deep understanding of the emotional stakes involved in Bird Person's wedding, recognizing interpersonal nuances that Rick, for all his genius, simply can't process. As the series progresses, we see Morty's confidence in his abilities grow substantially. He begins crafting his own plans and even manipulating Rick when necessary, showing strategic thinking that rivals the self-proclaimed smartest man in the universe. In the Ricklantis Mix-Up, Morty demonstrates remarkable strategic thinking by navigating the complex political landscape of the Citadel, understanding power dynamics and social structures well enough to achieve his goals in that environment. These aren't the actions of the simple human shield Rick initially claimed Morty to be. They're the calculated moves of someone developing their own intellectual identity. Creator commentary has acknowledged this aspect of Morty's character development, noting that his intelligence manifests differently than Rick's but is no less significant. The writers have intentionally shown Morty's growth from mere sidekick to a character whose intellect operates in dimensions that Rick's often doesn't reach. This difference in intelligence types creates a fascinating dynamic, where the supposedly dumb character sometimes resolves situations that baffle the genius. What makes Morty's intellectual development so compelling is that it occurs under constant belittlement. Rick's endless stream of insults about Morty's intelligence would crush most people's cognitive development, yet Morty continues to absorb, learn, and grow despite this hostile environment. This resilience itself demonstrates a form of emotional intelligence, the ability to maintain self-development even when facing constant degradation from a mentor figure. The evidence of Morty's intelligence emerges most clearly when he's faced with solving problems independently. When separated from Rick, we often see Morty applying lessons he's learned to navigate complex situations, showing that he doesn't just blindly follow Rick's instructions, but actually understands the principles behind them. His ability to adapt scientific concepts he's observed and apply them in new contexts demonstrates a deep, intuitive grasp of the universe's mechanics that goes far beyond rote memorization. It's worth noting that Morty's intellectual growth tracks alongside his moral development. As he becomes more confident in his ethical judgments, we also see him becoming more confident in his cognitive abilities. This suggests a fascinating connection between his moral reasoning and his broader intelligence. Perhaps his ethical framework provides the foundation that allows his other intellectual capabilities to flourish. What eventually emerges is a character whose intelligence is multifaceted rather than specialized. While Rick represents singular, laser-focused scientific genius, Morty embodies a more balanced form of intelligence that encompasses emotional awareness, ethical reasoning, practical problem-solving, and an increasingly substantial scientific understanding. This balanced intelligence might ultimately prove more adaptable in navigating the chaotic multiverse than Rick's specialized genius. The underestimation of Morty's intelligence by everyone around him, family, teachers, and especially Rick, serves an important narrative purpose. It creates moments of genuine surprise when Morty demonstrates capabilities that no one expected him to possess. These moments force both other characters and viewers to reconsider their assumptions about intelligence and capacity. The show repeatedly challenges us to question whether raw scientific genius like Rick's is actually superior to the more holistic intelligence that Morty develops. While our Morty struggles for recognition and respect, somewhere in the vast multiverse, another version of him stopped asking nicely and became possibly the most terrifying character in the entire series. This isn't just theoretical. We've actually met him. Evil Morty first appears in close Rick counters of the Rick kind and immediately shatters everything we thought we knew about what a Morty could be. Unlike our frequently nervous protagonist who follows Rick's lead, this Morty controls a Rick, literally, as it turns out. The episode's shocking reveal shows Evil Morty removing an eye patch that conceals advanced technology he uses to control his Rick, who is nothing more than a robot puppet. This isn't just a minor character variation. It's a complete inversion of the power dynamic that defines the entire show. What's particularly unsettling is how this revelation forces us to reconsider every Morty we've seen. If one Morty could break free from his subordinate role so completely that he can control his Rick like a marionette, what does that suggest about the potential within our Morty? The seeds of rebellion, intelligence, and even darkness exist in every version of the character. This theme gets expanded when we visit the Citadel, where we see just how systemically Mortys are mistreated across the multiverse. It's genuinely disturbing to watch countless Mortys treated as disposable tools, interchangeable, mass-produced sidekicks assigned to Ricks who view them as nothing more than walking cloaking devices. Some Mortys are literally grown in vats, others are sorted into tiers based on perceived usefulness, and many are discarded when they're no longer convenient. This society-wide devaluation of Mortys provides the perfect breeding ground for resentment, making Evil Morty's existence not just possible, but almost inevitable. Evil Morty's story takes an even more dramatic turn in The Ricklantis Mix-Up, also called Tales from the Citadel, where he orchestrates an elaborate scheme to become president of the Citadel. What's fascinating about this episode is how it reveals Evil Morty's extraordinary strategic abilities. He doesn't just win an election, he manipulates an entire society, eliminates his opponents without anyone suspecting him, and establishes himself as the leader of an interdimensional civilization populated by the smartest beings in the multiverse. The calculative intelligence and ruthless determination he displays are traits we occasionally glimpse in our Morty, but magnified and unconstrained by moral considerations. The campaign speech Evil Morty delivers is particularly revealing. When he says, "I'm tired of being a cog in the system that discards Mortys like garbage," we hear an anger that resonates with feelings our Morty has expressed in his more frustrated moments. The difference is that Evil Morty has channeled this frustration into a cold, methodical plan for revenge and liberation, rather than the temporary outbursts of defiance we see. From our Morty, this raises one of the show's most uncomfortable questions. How close is our Morty to becoming Evil Morty? We've seen our Morty endure countless humiliations, witness the destruction of entire realities, and suffer repeated trauma at Rick's hands. The concept of a Morty who got tired of Rick suddenly doesn't seem so far-fetched when we consider everything our protagonist has endured. Every time Rick dismisses Morty's ideas, puts him in danger, or treats him as expendable, we're watching potential steps toward creating another Evil Morty. In the Season 5 finale, Evil Morty's true ambitions become clear, and they're far more profound than mere revenge or dominance. He reveals his plan to escape the central finite curve, a walled-off section of the multiverse containing only realities where Rick is the smartest person alive. This reveal is staggering in its implications. Evil Morty has developed scientific understanding that rivals or even surpasses the smartest Ricks, allowing him to break free from a multiversal prison designed specifically to keep Ricks in power. When Evil Morty successfully punches through the barrier in a golden portal, he's doing something truly revolutionary, escaping a reality literally structured around Rick's supremacy. This action demonstrates not just incredible technical skill, but also a philosophical rejection of the entire premise that has defined the show's universe. He's not just rejecting his Rick, he's rejecting the very concept of a multiverse centered around any Rick. The visual contrast between Evil Morty and our Morty is deceptively minimal. Other than the eye patch, which turns out to be functional rather than decorative, he looks identical to our protagonist. This visual similarity serves an important narrative purpose, reminding us that the gap between being Rick's companion and becoming his nemesis might be smaller than we'd like to believe. Every moral compromise our Morty makes, every trauma he internalizes rather than processes, every bit of Rick's cynicism he absorbs, nudges him incrementally closer to this darker potential self. What makes Evil Morty such a compelling character isn't just his villainous actions, but how he functions as a mirror, reflecting both Morty's untapped potential and the consequences of Rick's treatment of his grandson. He represents a version of Morty who took all the lessons Rick taught him about manipulation, about the meaninglessness of conventional morality, about using superior intelligence as justification for any action, and applied them not just effectively, but better than Rick himself. This disturbing reflection becomes even more powerful when we consider the moments where our Morty has shown flashes of similar behavior. We've seen him manipulate Rick, outthink opponents, and occasionally display a ruthless streak when pushed too far. The difference isn't necessarily in capability, but in choice. Our Morty still maintains a moral core that Evil Morty appears to have abandoned. That moral core separating our Morty from Evil Morty isn't just theoretical. It manifests most clearly in his capacity for genuine emotional connection. While Evil Morty pursues power and revenge with cold calculation, our Morty's journey through teenage romance reveals surprising depths of vulnerability and growth that might be his strongest defense against becoming his darker counterpart. Morty's romantic life begins exactly as you'd expect from an awkward 14-year-old. A hopeless, stammering infatuation with Jessica, the pretty redhead from school. In those early seasons, Morty's crush is almost painfully stereotypical. He can barely form coherent sentences around her, fantasizes about impossible scenarios where she notices him, and makes embarrassingly poor decisions just to get her attention. This initial portrayal establishes Morty as the quintessential hormone-driven teenager, a kid whose emotional development is as underdeveloped as his social skills. What makes this starting point so important is how dramatically it contrasts with where Morty eventually ends up. The evolution of Morty's romantic pursuits doesn't just happen in parallel to his adventures with Rick. It's shaped by them, sometimes in traumatic ways that force emotional growth he might never have experienced otherwise. The Vat of Acid episode marks a pivotal moment in Morty's romantic development. Far beyond his superficial crush on Jessica, we see Morty experience something much more profound. A genuine relationship built on mutual attraction and shared experiences. What makes this storyline particularly significant is how it portrays Morty's emotional vulnerability. He doesn't just fall in love, he falls deeply, completely, in a way that transforms him. And when that relationship ends in heartbreak, we witness Morty processing genuine loss for perhaps the first time. This episode does something important for Morty's character that his cosmic adventures with Rick rarely accomplish. It validates that his ordinary human emotions matter. It shows that amid all the interdimensional chaos, Morty's capacity to love and feel heartbreak is a fundamental part of who he is. The relationship may have been erased from the timeline, but the emotional impact shapes Morty in ways that continue throughout the series. By Season 5, Morty's approach to relationships has undergone a remarkable transformation. His connection with Planetina demonstrates how far he's come from the boy who once could only awkwardly stammer at Jessica from across the hallway. With Planetina, Morty forms a bond based on something much deeper than physical attraction. They connect through shared values and genuine emotional resonance. What's most telling about Morty's growth is not just that he forms this more mature connection, but how he handles its conclusion. When Planetina's environmentalism turns violent and her values shift in ways Morty can't accept, he makes, perhaps, the most mature decision we've seen from him. He ends the relationship. This isn't the action of a desperate, hormone-driven teenager who would do anything for attention from his crush. It's the difficult choice of someone who understands that love sometimes means letting go when values fundamentally diverge. The aftermath of this breakup gives us one of the most touching moments in the series. Beth finds Morty crying on the stairs, and instead of dismissing his pain or making it about herself, she simply sits with him, validating his emotional suffering. "I'm sorry you had to be the adult," she tells him, acknowledging both his pain and his maturity. This scene is significant not just for Morty's emotional development, but for how it positions him within the family. No longer just the awkward kid, but someone whose emotional experiences are complex and worthy of respect. The contrast between early season Morty and this more emotionally mature version couldn't be clearer. Where he once pursued Jessica with single-minded obsession, willing to risk literally apocalyptic consequences for a chance at her affection, he now demonstrates the ability to form genuine connections and make difficult emotional choices based on deeper values. This evolution showcases something fundamentally human about Morty that Evil Morty appears to have abandoned: the capacity to remain vulnerable despite trauma, to continue connecting with others despite being hurt. In many ways, Morty's romantic journey serves as a counterbalance to the nihilistic worldview that Rick constantly pushes. Rick's perspective, that nothing matters in an infinite multiverse, would suggest that emotional attachments are pointless. But Morty's continued pursuit of connection, despite knowing all that Rick knows about the universe, represents a different kind of strength. It's a refusal to surrender his humanity, even when confronted with cosmic meaninglessness. This aspect of Morty's character development offers perhaps the clearest distinction between him and Evil Morty. While both have experienced trauma at the hands of Rick's, our Morty channels that experience into continued growth and connection, while Evil Morty transforms it into cold ambition and revenge. One preserves his capacity for love despite knowing its risks. The other appears to have abandoned emotional connection entirely in pursuit of freedom and power. These romantic storylines might seem like typical teenage subplots in a sci-fi show, but they're actually central to understanding who Morty is becoming. Each relationship, from his awkward crush on Jessica to his genuine connection with Planetina, represents a step in his emotional maturation, teaching him something about himself and how he relates to others. The fact that Morty can still love, still hurt, and still grow from these experiences despite everything he's been through in the multiverse is perhaps his most defining character trait. Beyond Morty's romantic encounters lies another layer of his evolving identity: the shifting dynamic between him and his own family. While most teenagers navigate changing family relationships, Morty's transformation is accelerated and complicated by the cosmic adventures he experiences alongside Rick. What starts as a seemingly ordinary family structure gradually transforms into something much more complex as Morty begins stepping into new roles within the Smith household. In the early days, Morty occupied a predictable position in his family hierarchy, the overlooked middle child caught between parental neglect and sibling indifference. His father, Jerry, viewed him with a mixture of concern and disappointment. His mother, Beth, was too preoccupied with her own issues to provide meaningful attention, and his sister, Summer, regarded him with typical teenage disdain. This dynamic created the perfect conditions for Rick to swoop in and claim Morty's loyalty, pulling him away from the family unit and into the chaotic multiverse. But something remarkable happens as Morty's adventures with Rick continue. Rather than pulling him further from his family, these experiences gradually transform how he relates to each family member. Take his relationship with Jerry, for instance. What begins as almost unbearable embarrassment gradually evolves into something more nuanced. The moments where Morty and Jerry share adventures without Rick's influence become particularly revealing, offering glimpses of genuine connection that would have seemed impossible in earlier seasons. This evolution reflects Morty's growing emotional maturity. As he witnesses countless realities and dimensions, he develops a broader perspective that allows him to see Jerry beyond the narrow lens of teenage embarrassment. He begins to recognize his father's insecurities and struggles in a way that fosters unexpected moments of empathy. Though Morty never fully escapes the occasional eye roll at Jerry's expense, their relationship develops layers that weren't present in the beginning. Perhaps even more significant is Morty's changing relationship with his mother, Beth. As Morty learns more about Beth's troubled childhood and her complicated history with Rick, he develops a protective instinct that shifts their dynamic. This becomes particularly evident after The ABCs of Beth, when Morty displays surprising emotional maturity in processing the revelation about Beth's violent childhood tendencies. Rather than being disturbed or retreating from this knowledge, Morty demonstrates an ability to understand the complexities of his mother's character, a level of empathy that speaks to his own growth. This protective instinct toward Beth represents a remarkable role reversal. The son who once needed his mother's protection gradually becomes a source of emotional support himself. While Beth rarely acknowledges this shift explicitly, the subtle changes in their interactions reveal a new dimension to their relationship, one where Morty occasionally provides the emotional stability that Beth herself sometimes lacks. But nowhere is Morty's evolving family dynamic more evident than in his relationship with Summer. What begins as a typical sibling rivalry marked by mutual annoyance transforms into something resembling an alliance as Summer becomes increasingly involved in Rick's adventures. This shared experience creates common ground between the siblings, fostering a collaborative relationship built on mutual understanding of the multiverse's dangers and wonders. As they face cosmic threats together, Morty and Summer develop complementary skills and a shorthand communication that serves them well in crisis situations. Their teamwork becomes increasingly effective, showing how their shared experiences have created a bond that transcends their earlier petty rivalries. In many ways, Summer becomes the only person who truly understands what Morty experiences on a regular basis, creating a unique bond between them. Morty's growing understanding of his parents' marriage also reflects his maturing perspective. As he gains his own relationship experience and witnesses countless versions of his family across different dimensions, he develops a more nuanced view of Jerry and Beth's dysfunctional relationship. The simplistic judgments of early seasons give way to a more complex understanding of marriage's challenges, allowing him to navigate his family's tensions with greater wisdom. This broader perspective becomes particularly apparent when Morty witnesses alternative versions of his parents' relationship throughout the multiverse. Each variation provides new insight into the fundamental dynamics between Jerry and Beth, allowing Morty to see their marriage not as a fixed entity, but as one possibility among many. This cosmic perspective grants him a unique vantage point from which to understand his parents' struggles. What makes this evolution particularly remarkable is how it transforms Morty's role within the family structure. The passive, overlooked teenager gradually becomes someone who actively influences family dynamics and occasionally even protects his family members from threats both cosmic and emotional. This progression from passive observer to active participant marks one of the most significant aspects of Morty's character development. We can see this shift most clearly in episodes where Morty takes charge during family crises, making decisions that protect the family unit even when those decisions put him at odds with Rick. His growing confidence in these situations demonstrates how far he's come from the nervous, uncertain boy we met in early seasons. Though still a teenager, Morty increasingly functions as a stabilizing force within the chaotic Smith household. These evolving family dynamics reveal important aspects of Morty's character that might otherwise remain hidden beneath the more dramatic elements of his cosmic adventures. His willingness to support Jerry despite his father's flaws, his protective instinct toward Beth despite her emotional limitations, and his growing partnership with Summer all speak to Morty's fundamental capacity for connection and growth. Beyond family connections, the most complex and revealing relationship in Morty's life remains his partnership with Rick Sanchez. What started as blatant exploitation has transformed into something neither character would openly acknowledge: a genuine bond that defies Rick's nihilistic worldview. The science might be simple, but the emotional evolution between them represents the most unpredictable experiment in the multiverse. At the beginning of their adventures, Rick made no effort to hide Morty's utilitarian purpose. Morty was nothing more than walking camouflage, a human shield whose brainwaves could mask Rick's genius from detection. This cold functionality defined their early dynamic, with Rick treating Morty as an expendable tool rather than a person with feelings and agency. The power imbalance couldn't have been more extreme. A super genius scientist with godlike abilities paired with an anxious, insecure teenager who could barely stand up for himself. But something unexpected happened as their adventures continued. Rick began witnessing moments of growth in his grandson that even he couldn't dismiss. These acknowledgments were never straightforward. Rick would never simply compliment Morty or express pride, but they emerged in subtle ways that reflected Rick's changing perception. Where he once saw only a shield, he began seeing potential, even if he would drown this recognition in insults and verbal abuse to maintain emotional distance. The evolution becomes visible in how Rick gradually gives Morty more responsibility and agency during their adventures. In early episodes, Morty is literally dragged along, given minimal information, and expected to simply follow orders. By later seasons, we see Rick occasionally following Morty's lead or, more tellingly, seeking his input on complex decisions. These moments, though rare, signal a fundamental shift in how Rick values Morty's perspective. Rick's protective instincts toward Morty evolve significantly throughout the series. Initially absent entirely, Rick begins displaying increasingly defensive behaviors when external threats endanger his grandson. What's particularly revealing is that these protective actions often occur when Morty isn't looking or is unaware, suggesting they stem from genuine concern rather than performance. Rick maintains his caustic facade verbally, while his actions tell a different story about his growing attachment. In autoerotic assimilation, we witness one of Rick's most vulnerable moments as he attempts suicide following a painful breakup. This scene is pivotal not just for revealing Rick's emotional depth, but for showing that he's willing to let Morty see glimpses of his true pain, something the hyper-defensive scientist would never allow if he truly viewed Morty as merely a tool. These moments of vulnerability, though rare, establish a growing emotional connection that humanizes their relationship beyond its functional origins. The Vat of Acid episode showcases Rick's contradictory feelings toward Morty perfectly. On one hand, Rick goes to elaborate lengths to teach Morty a lesson about respecting his ideas, constructing an entire fake device just to ultimately humiliate him. On the other hand, this bizarre form of care shows that Rick is invested in Morty's development, albeit through twisted methods that reflect his own damaged approach to relationships. Rick could simply abandon Morty for a more compliant version from another dimension, but instead, he puts considerable effort into teaching the Morty he has. Perhaps the most revealing insight into Rick's feelings comes in Rick Jack, when we learn that Rick has been searching for his original Morty's killer. This quest for vengeance reveals a depth of emotional attachment that Rick typically refuses to acknowledge. The fact that Rick would dedicate himself to avenging a Morty contradicts his frequent claims that Mortys are disposable and interchangeable. This revelation suggests that beneath Rick's calculated exterior lies genuine connection, even if expressing it directly remains beyond his emotional capabilities. What makes their relationship particularly fascinating is how it evolves without either character fully acknowledging the change. Rick continues his verbal abuse and dismissal of Morty, even as his actions demonstrate increasing respect. Morty, for his part, continues to challenge Rick and assert independence while still choosing to participate in their adventures together. Their partnership grows not through heartfelt conversations or explicit recognition, but through accumulated experiences that gradually transform how they function together. The irony of their relationship is that Rick, who claims to have transcended emotional attachment as a weakness, finds himself increasingly dependent on Morty not just for practical purposes but for emotional grounding. Morty, initially desperate for Rick's approval, gradually needs this validation less as he develops his own sense of worth. Their trajectories cross, with Rick becoming more emotionally invested while Morty becomes more independent, creating a more balanced dynamic than either would have predicted. Creator commentary emphasizes that this evolving partnership forms the emotional core of the series. The writers intentionally craft moments that highlight their changing dynamic, revealing the development of mutual respect beneath the surface of conflict. What makes their relationship compelling isn't dramatic declarations of familial love, but the subtle shifts that occur when two damaged people begin to value each other, despite their best efforts to remain detached. By later seasons, we see something resembling true partnership emerge. Rick occasionally acknowledges Morty's contributions, following his grandson's lead when Morty demonstrates superior understanding of a situation. More significantly, Rick begins defending not just Morty's physical safety, but his autonomy and choices. A profound shift from early episodes where Morty's preferences were irrelevant. This evolution represents Rick's grudging recognition that Morty has grown into someone worthy of respect rather than mere manipulation. While Rick's growing respect for Morty signifies an important evolution in their relationship, there's another dimension to their dynamic that's equally fascinating. Those rare moments when this supposedly simple teenager delivers insights so profound they stop even the smartest man in the multiverse dead in his tracks. Despite his anxiety and traumatic experiences, or perhaps because of them, Morty occasionally demonstrates wisdom that surpasses his genius grandfather's understanding, particularly when it comes to emotional and philosophical matters. What makes these moments so powerful is how they subvert our expectations. We've grown accustomed to Rick's dismissive attitude toward Morty's intelligence. Yet when these flashes of wisdom emerge, they create some of the show's most meaningful moments. These insights aren't delivered with Rick's characteristic arrogance, but instead come from a place of hard-earned experience and emotional honesty that Rick often lacks. In Interdimensional Cable 2, we witness one of these powerful moments when Morty demonstrates remarkable emotional intelligence while comforting his father. While Rick typically responds to emotional situations with detachment or mockery, Morty connects with Jerry on a human level, showing empathy that Rick seems incapable of expressing. This contrast highlights how Morty's emotional intelligence complements Rick's scientific genius, creating a more balanced perspective when they work together. These wisdom moments typically emerge from Morty's unique position as someone who has witnessed cosmic horrors but hasn't lost his humanity. In Mortyplicity, his quick acceptance of the decoy situation reveals an adaptability to existential dread that would psychologically break most people. Where others might spiral into denial or panic, Morty processes the situation with surprising maturity, showcasing how his countless adventures have prepared him to face reality as it is, not as he wishes it to be. What's particularly fascinating about Morty's insights is how they often catch Rick completely off guard. We see moments throughout the series where Rick pauses, genuinely surprised by Morty's perspective on existence and relationships. These instances force Rick to reevaluate his own nihilistic worldview, even if he rarely admits it. When Morty shares reflections on the nature of existence that challenge Rick's perspective, we witness brief moments where the power dynamic between them shifts. The student momentarily becoming the teacher. Morty's wisdom doesn't come from academic knowledge or scientific expertise, but from something Rick often lacks: emotional honesty and the willingness to engage with difficult truths rather than numbing himself to them. While Rick drowns his pain in alcohol and distractions, Morty confronts his experiences head-on, processing them in ways that lead to genuine growth. This emotional processing gives Morty access to insights that elude Rick despite his vastly superior intellect. The show's creators have noted this aspect of Morty's character, emphasizing his role as an occasional voice of wisdom in the series. Despite his youth and inexperience in conventional terms, Morty delivers some of the show's most profound philosophical moments. This deliberate storytelling choice creates a compelling contrast with his typically anxious character, revealing depths that might otherwise remain hidden beneath his nervous exterior. In the Ricklantis mix-up, Morty expresses a remarkably mature understanding of the multiverse when he states, "The only thing that matters is that we keep moving forward." This simple yet profound observation reflects his growth from a passive character to one who recognizes the importance of agency, even in a seemingly meaningless cosmos. While Rick often uses the infinite nature of the multiverse to justify apathy, Morty finds a way to acknowledge cosmic insignificance while still affirming the value of moving forward. These moments of clarity typically emerge after particularly traumatic experiences, suggesting that Morty's wisdom is hard-earned through his interdimensional ordeals. Unlike Rick, who uses science to distance himself from emotional reality, Morty integrates his traumatic experiences into a coherent worldview that acknowledges pain while finding meaning within it. This integration allows him to maintain his moral compass despite exposure to forces that would typically shatter one's ethical framework. Morty's insights often center around finding balance between opposing forces: chaos and order, meaning and meaninglessness, connection and isolation. Where Rick typically embraces extremes, Morty instinctively searches for the middle path. This tendency reveals a natural philosophical inclination that Rick, for all his genius, struggles to access due to his emotional barriers and rigid thinking patterns. The evolution of Morty's wisdom tracks alongside his character development throughout the series. Early insights tend to be reactive and defensive, helping him cope with immediate trauma. As the series progresses, they become more proactive and universal, reflecting a maturing perspective that extends beyond self-preservation to encompass broader ethical and existential concerns. This progression mirrors Morty's overall growth from a frightened sidekick to a more autonomous individual. Perhaps the most powerful aspect of Morty's wisdom is how it serves as a counterbalance to Rick's nihilism. Where Rick sees a meaningless universe that justifies selfish behavior, Morty finds ways to create meaning through connection and choice, even while acknowledging the cosmic void. This perspective doesn't reject Rick's scientific understanding of reality, but complements it with an emotional dimension that Rick purposefully avoids. What makes these wisdom moments especially interesting is how they're delivered without pretense or self-importance. Morty doesn't position himself as wise or insightful. He simply shares his honest perspective, often when pressured or during moments of crisis. This authenticity gives his insights a weight that Rick's more calculated pronouncements sometimes lack, making them resonate with both characters and viewers alike. The contrast between Morty's wisdom and Rick's genius highlights one of the show's central themes: that different types of intelligence are valuable in navigating a complex multiverse. Rick's scientific brilliance allows for technological miracles, but often leaves him emotionally stunted and isolated. Morty's emotional intelligence and hard-earned wisdom enable connections and meaning-making that elude Rick despite his vast knowledge. Together, they form a more complete perspective than either could achieve alone. These wisdom moments reveal that Morty's traumatic experiences haven't just hardened him, they've deepened him. Each dimensional catastrophe, each brush with death, each moral compromise has forced him to develop a philosophical framework that can accommodate both the wonder and horror of infinite realities. The result is a uniquely grounded perspective that grounds Rick's cosmic adventures in human terms. Morty's evolution from a terrified teenager into someone capable of standing on his own represents one of the most remarkable transformations we've seen in modern animation. The Morty we now encounter in recent seasons has developed a fascinating blend of cynicism and hope that makes him almost unrecognizable from his earlier self. While he still carries traces of that nervous kid we first met, he's now layered with complexity born from countless traumatic interdimensional experiences. In the most recent seasons, we see Morty consistently making his own choices without waiting for Rick's approval or direction. Take the episode Edge of Morty, Rick Die Rickpeat, where Morty completely defies Rick's warnings about using death crystals. Instead of panicking and following orders like he would have in early seasons, he confidently seizes control of his destiny, determined to create the future he wants regardless of Rick's opinion. This remarkable display of agency shows just how far he's come from being Rick's perpetual follower. What's particularly impressive about modern Morty isn't just his willingness to oppose Rick, but his growing competence across multiple domains. He's gradually absorbed scientific knowledge through osmosis. Catching glimpses of Rick's methods and technological understanding has given Morty a foundation of interdimensional know-how that would be impressive even for an adult. While he's no super genius, Morty now understands enough about portal technology, alien biology, and cosmic threats to function independently when necessary. His combat skills have similarly evolved from complete helplessness to surprising effectiveness. Early Morty would freeze or flee when faced with danger, but current Morty has become desensitized to violence in a way that's both impressive and slightly concerning. Though never portrayed as a master fighter, his survival instincts have been honed through repeatedly facing death, allowing him to navigate dangerous situations with a steadiness that would have been impossible for his younger self. What's most interesting is how Morty has managed to maintain his core moral compass despite everything he's experienced. His ethics haven't disappeared. They've just become more nuanced. In Rick Mirai Jack, we see Morty grappling with the complex implications of his relationship with Rick Prime, demonstrating a sophisticated balance between cynicism about their adventures and optimism about possible futures. He acknowledges the darkness they've encountered while still holding on to hope, a delicate balance that shows impressive emotional maturity. This moral evolution has allowed modern Morty to make ethical choices that would have overwhelmed his earlier self. In A Rick Convenient Mort, Morty's relationship with Planetina showcases his ability to make difficult decisions based on shared values rather than simple attraction. When Planetina's methods become too extreme, Morty chooses to end their relationship despite his genuine feelings for her. This represents a significant step beyond his earlier obsession with Jessica, demonstrating how his emotional maturity has caught up with his other forms of growth. Yet alongside this growth, we've also witnessed glimpses of a darker potential within Morty. When given access to power or left unsupervised, Morty occasionally reveals troubling tendencies that echo Rick's worst traits. His adventures have exposed him to Rick's nihilistic perspective, and we occasionally see Morty adopting elements of this worldview, calculating odds, making cold decisions, and sometimes prioritizing self-interest over idealism. These moments serve as reminders that Morty walks a fine line between becoming a more balanced person and potentially sliding toward becoming something like Evil Morty in the future. The creators have spoken about Morty's character development as a journey of self-discovery, noting that his experiences throughout the series have shaped him into someone capable of making difficult ethical choices. This growth hasn't happened in a vacuum. It's the direct result of trauma processing and adaptation. Rather than being broken by the horrors he's witnessed, Morty has somehow found ways to integrate these experiences into a functional, albeit somewhat damaged, personality. What makes current Morty particularly compelling is the tension between his growing confidence and the occasional reemergence of his insecurities. In Analyze Piss, we see Morty beginning to understand himself as more than just Rick's sidekick, asserting his own identity and moral perspective. Yet vulnerability still shows through in moments of stress or uncertainty, creating a character who feels authentically human despite the bizarre circumstances of his life. Morty's relationship with Rick has necessarily evolved alongside his personal growth. No longer simply following orders out of fear or naivety, Morty now engages with Rick as something closer to a partner, albeit one who still occupies a subordinate position. Rick occasionally acknowledges Morty's contributions and capabilities, though usually in his characteristically backhanded way. The dynamic between them has shifted from pure exploitation to something more complex, a partnership with deeply unequal power that nevertheless contains moments of genuine connection and mutual respect. This evolution hasn't been without setbacks. Morty still occasionally reverts to people-pleasing behavior, particularly when feeling insecure. He still seeks Rick's approval in certain contexts and can be manipulated through guilt or fear. These inconsistencies don't represent failures in character development, but rather realistic complexity. People don't grow in straight lines, especially teenagers navigating the most bizarre coming-of-age story imaginable. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of modern Morty is his resilience. Despite witnessing cosmic horrors that would break most adults, repeatedly facing death, and processing trauma that most people never encounter in their entire lives, Morty continues to function and even thrive. He hasn't become completely hardened or broken. Instead, he's developed a pragmatic approach to life's challenges while maintaining the capacity for connection, empathy, and even occasional optimism. The contrast between current Morty and the character we met in the pilot is striking. What began as a one-dimensional nervous sidekick has become one of animation's most complex characters. Someone who balances terrifying knowledge of multiversal reality with the normal developmental challenges of adolescence. He navigates grief, loss, and moral ambiguity, while still finding moments of joy and connection that keep him from surrendering to nihilism entirely. What if I told you that Morty Smith's entire psychological profile was established in just the first few episodes of Rick and Morty? When we first meet Morty in the pilot episode, he's already displaying the hallmark signs of anxiety that will define his character throughout the series. There's his pronounced stutter, his hunched posture, and his nervous mannerisms that immediately communicate to viewers that this is a kid who's perpetually on edge. But here's the thing about Morty's anxiety. It existed before Rick came back into the family's life. In those early episodes, we see Morty struggling with the typical concerns of a 14-year-old boy. He's worried about fitting in at school, he's awkward around his crush Jessica, and he's constantly being bullied by other students. These everyday anxieties form the foundation of Morty's character, but they're quickly overshadowed by something much more profound when Rick enters the picture. Suddenly, Morty's concerns about homework and high school social dynamics seem trivial compared to the cosmic horrors he's forced to confront. The pilot episode wastes no time establishing the dynamic that will shape Morty's psychological development. In the middle of the night, Rick drags a half-asleep Morty from his bed and takes him on a journey to another dimension. Right away, Morty is thrust into life-threatening danger when Rick reveals they need to smuggle mega seeds through interdimensional customs. The way Rick casually tells Morty he needs to put these seeds way up inside your butthole is our first glimpse at how Rick's scientific objectives consistently override any concern for Morty's comfort or safety. This initial adventure establishes a pattern that becomes the primary source of Morty's anxiety throughout the series. Rick places Morty in dangerous situations with little warning or preparation, expects immediate compliance, and shows minimal concern for the psychological impact these experiences have on his grandson. The seeds eventually dissolve, causing Morty to collapse in front of his family and school, creating one of the first instances where Morty's cosmic adventures directly interfere with his normal teenage life. By the third episode, Anatomy Park, Morty's exposure to trauma escalates dramatically. Rick shrinks Morty and injects him into the body of a dying homeless man named Ruben. What makes this adventure particularly traumatic is how it forces Morty to confront mortality in an incredibly visceral way. When Ruben dies, Morty has to navigate through the decaying organs of a corpse, surrounded by death on a microscopic level. The episode concludes with Rick casually expanding Ruben's dead body in the sky during Christmas, traumatizing not just Morty, but everyone who witnesses the giant naked corpse raining down blood and tissue. What's fascinating about these early episodes is watching Morty develop coping mechanisms in real time. We see him initially respond with panic and protest, but quickly shift to nervous compliance as a survival strategy. His rambling becomes more pronounced when he's anxious, often talking himself through terrifying situations as a way to process what's happening. This nervous verbal processing becomes one of Morty's most consistent traits, a psychological response to being constantly overwhelmed by circumstances beyond his comprehension. As the first season progresses, we witness the toll these adventures take on Morty's everyday life. His school performance plummets, with teachers noting his increased absences and distracted behavior when he does attend. There's a growing psychological split between Morty's normal human existence and his cosmic experiences with Rick. In M. Night Shyamalan Aliens, Morty can't focus on his math test because he's preoccupied with whether reality itself is simulated. This represents a profound shift in Morty's psychology. How can algebra matter when you've witnessed the collapse of entire civilizations? The episode Me Seeks and Destroy offers a crucial insight into Morty's growing frustration with his role as Rick's sidekick. For the first time, Morty demands to lead an adventure of his own, showing early signs of the assertiveness that will develop in later seasons. When Rick dismisses the psychological toll their adventures are taking, Morty counters with surprising eloquence. "You know what, Rick? I'm sick of doing what you want. Whatever adventure you're going on, it's my choice this time." This moment marks one of the first instances where Morty directly challenges Rick's authority, revealing a resilience that exists alongside his anxiety. What makes Morty's psychological development in Season 1 so compelling is the surprising adaptability he demonstrates despite his ongoing anxiety. In Rick Potion number 9, after Rick accidentally turns the entire world population into Cronenberg monsters, Morty is initially horrified. Yet by the episode's end, he follows Rick to a new reality and, in a disturbing twist, helps bury the corpses of his alternate self and Rick. The 1,000-yard stare Morty develops after this experience speaks volumes about his psychological state. He's learning to normalize the unnormalizable. This pattern repeats throughout the first season. In Something Ricked This Way Comes, Morty quickly adapts to the existence of cursed items. In Close Rick Counters of the Rick Kind, he processes the discovery of the Citadel of Ricks and the existence of infinite Mortys with remarkable composure. Each of these instances shows how Morty's mind is expanding to accommodate cosmic horror while still maintaining enough of his humanity to function. By the season finale, Ricksy Business, we see a Morty who has significantly evolved from the stuttering, perpetually terrified teenager of the pilot. When Rick freezes time at the end of the episode, Morty expresses concern but ultimately accepts this new reality without the panic we would have seen earlier. He's not free of anxiety, far from it, but he's developing the psychological tools to function within Rick's chaotic universe. What's particularly interesting about Morty's anxiety is that it doesn't diminish as he gains experience. It transforms. His initial fear response to immediate dangers evolves into a more existential anxiety about his place in a meaningless multiverse. This evolution suggests that Morty's anxiety isn't a character flaw to be overcome, but a realistic psychological response to constantly facing scenarios that the human mind wasn't designed to comprehend. That transformation in Morty's anxiety takes a sharp, devastating turn during one specific adventure, not from witnessing some cosmic horror, but from something disturbingly mundane. When Morty encounters Mr. Jellybean in a fairy tale bathroom, he discovers that sometimes the monsters hiding in familiar places can leave deeper psychological scars than any interdimensional threat. In Me Seeks and Destroy, we see Morty at a pivotal moment in his relationship with Rick. Fed up with constantly being dragged along on Rick's chaotic adventures, Morty finally stands his ground and proposes a wager. If he leads a successful adventure, Rick has to agree to let Morty choose one out of every 10 future trips. This isn't just about Morty wanting to have fun, it's about him seeking autonomy and validation. He chooses a seemingly innocent fantasy world, complete with giant beans and a storybook village, as the perfect setting to prove his capability. What makes this episode particularly significant is that Morty's desire for independence becomes the very thing that places him in danger. As they visit a tavern in the village, Morty excuses himself to use the restroom, an ordinary moment that would normally pass without comment. But in this seemingly safe space, away from Rick's protection, Morty encounters Mr. Jellybean, a character whose candy-colored appearance masks something truly sinister. The bathroom scene itself is handled with remarkable restraint for a show that often revels in graphic content. The assault is implied rather than explicitly shown, but the psychological impact is unmistakable. We see Morty initially confused, then frightened, then fighting back with everything he has. The sequence is brief but psychologically devastating, especially when you consider this is happening to a 14-year-old who has just started to build confidence in his ability to navigate strange worlds. What happens immediately after the assault is equally important for understanding Morty's psychological development. When he returns to Rick, visibly shaken and disheveled, he doesn't tell Rick what happened. Instead, Morty says, "Let's just go home, okay? I don't want to be around here anymore." This suppression of trauma represents a critical psychological response that shapes Morty moving forward. Rather than seeking help or justice, Morty internalizes the experience, creating a pattern of dealing with trauma in isolation that will follow him throughout the series. The change in Morty's body language and behavior after the bathroom incident is stark and immediate. Before the encounter, Morty is enthusiastic and confident, eagerly leading the way through the village. Afterward, his posture becomes more withdrawn, his voice loses its enthusiasm, and the spring in his step disappears entirely. In one particularly telling moment, Morty sits slumped at a table, looking defeated and hollow. Not just disappointed that his adventure has gone wrong, but fundamentally altered by what he's experienced. When Rick realizes something serious has happened, he offers to end the adventure and go home. But Morty insists on continuing to the giant's treasury to complete his quest. This decision reveals another layer of Morty's psychological response. a determination to prove himself capable despite his trauma, suggesting that he fears being seen as weak or vulnerable. The need to appear strong in front of Rick becomes a psychological defense mechanism, one that prevents him from processing his trauma in a healthy way. The resolution of the Mr. Jellybean storyline adds another complex layer to Morty's developing psychology. Though Morty never tells Rick exactly what happened, Rick pieces it together and, as they're leaving the fantasy world, casually eliminates Mr. Jellybean with a laser blast. This moment creates a paradoxical effect on Morty's trust issues. On one hand, Rick's violent retaliation demonstrates a protective instinct that reinforces Morty's dependence on him for safety. On the other hand, it confirms Morty's growing suspicion that violence and danger lurk everywhere, even in seemingly innocent places. This incident establishes a pattern that will define Morty's approach to trust throughout the series. He begins to develop a heightened awareness of danger in ordinary situations, a form of hypervigilance common in trauma survivors. Yet simultaneously, he becomes more dependent on Rick, who represents both a source of danger and protection. Morty's relationship with Rick becomes increasingly complex after this event, as he begins to recognize that while Rick exposes him to cosmic horrors, he's also the only one who can truly understand and sometimes protect him from those very dangers. The psychological significance of the Mr. Jellybean incident extends far beyond this single episode. It creates a framework where Morty learns to be suspicious of seemingly innocent situations while simultaneously clinging to Rick as a source of safety, despite Rick's own dangerous and manipulative tendencies. This dual response, increased suspicion of strangers coupled with increased dependence on the familiar, even when the familiar is itself dangerous, is a common psychological pattern among trauma survivors. This landmark moment in Morty's psychological development is handled with surprising nuance for an animated comedy series. The creators approached this sensitive topic with care, using it not merely for shock value, but to explore the complexities of Morty's character and the consequences of trauma. Critics and viewers have noted that this scene represented a bold narrative choice that addressed sensitive topics in a way that is rarely seen in animated series, prompting important discussions about the portrayal of trauma in media. The psychological effects of assault trauma on teenagers can lead to long-lasting trust issues, anxiety, and changes in behavior. Morty's experience exemplifies these effects as he becomes more withdrawn following the incident. His immediate response to suppress the trauma rather than share it with Rick reflects a common coping mechanism among trauma survivors, particularly teenagers who may not have the emotional tools to process such experiences. Beyond the traumatic experiences that shaped Morty's wariness of strangers lies an even more profound transformation in his character. The innocent, hesitant teenager who once criticized Rick's casual violence would eventually make a calculated decision to kill a being he'd formed a deep connection with. And this moral turning point would forever change how Morty navigates the multiverse. In the episode Morty Night Run, we see Morty's moral compass put to its first true test. The adventure begins innocently enough when Morty objects to Rick selling an antimatter gun to an assassin named Krombopulos Michael. This initial objection showcases Morty's baseline morality, a teenager who still believes in clear boundaries between right and wrong. When Morty discovers that Krombopulos Michael intends to kill a gaseous being detained at a government facility, his immediate instinct is to rescue this creature. This rescue mission isn't just Morty rebelling against Rick's indifference. It's Morty actively choosing to save a life because he believes it's the right thing to do. What makes this particular adventure so psychologically significant is how it builds Morty's attachment to this gaseous entity, whom he nicknames Fart. Their relationship develops through an unusual telepathic connection, where Fart communicates with Morty by projecting images and thoughts directly into his mind. This mental bond creates an intimacy that Morty rarely experiences in his adventures. Suddenly, he's not just a bystander, but a protector with a genuine emotional stake in another being's survival. The relationship deepens further through one of the series' most memorable musical moments. When Fart performs Goodbye Moonmen, a psychedelic ballad shared telepathically with Morty, we witness a rare moment of beauty and connection in Morty's often chaotic universe. This musical bonding represents something Morty desperately craves: meaningful connection in a multiverse that consistently reminds him of his insignificance. For once, Morty isn't just Rick's reluctant sidekick. He's a hero on his own mission, saving a being that communicates with him in ways that feel special and validating. This makes the psychological turning point all the more devastating. As their adventure progresses, Morty gradually learns more about Fart's true nature and intentions. The revelation comes when Fart casually mentions plans to return to his dimension and bring back more of his kind to transform all carbon-based life, essentially wiping out humanity and all Earth life. In this moment, Morty faces his first true moral dilemma: continue protecting a being he's grown attached to, or take action to prevent genocide. What's fascinating from a psychological perspective is watching Morty process this information. There's no immediate reaction. Instead, we see the wheels turning as he weighs his emotional connection against the larger consequences at stake. This internal calculation represents a significant evolution from the Morty we met in earlier episodes, who might have panicked or simply followed Rick's lead. The climactic moment comes when Morty makes his decision. After helping Fart reach a portal that would allow him to return home and initiate his plans, Morty pulls out the antimatter gun. In a quiet, determined voice, he says, "I'm sorry," before firing and killing the very being he fought so hard to protect. This isn't a kill made in self-defense or panic. It's a deliberate, calculated choice to take a life for what Morty perceives as the greater good. This single moment creates a psychological template that Morty will follow throughout the series. He's learned that morality isn't always black and white. Sometimes protecting the many requires sacrificing the few, even when those few include beings you care about. The innocence that once characterized Morty's worldview begins to give way to a more nuanced understanding of moral complexity. In later seasons, we see this template applied repeatedly as Morty makes increasingly pragmatic choices. He becomes more willing to engage in violence when necessary, more capable of making utilitarian calculations about who lives and who dies. This doesn't mean Morty becomes callous, quite the opposite. Each difficult choice seems to weigh on him, contributing to the psychological burden he carries. But he makes these choices nonetheless, showing a growing maturity and willingness to face moral complexity head-on. The psychological significance of the Fart episode is magnified when we consider that prior to this, Morty had primarily killed in self-defense or accidentally. His moral objections to Rick's casual violence were a defining character trait. By choosing to kill Fart, Morty crosses a psychological threshold from which there's no return. He can no longer claim moral simplicity or innocence. He's now someone capable of making the same kinds of difficult decisions he once criticized Rick for making. This moral evolution doesn't transform Morty into a cold-blooded killer. Instead, it gives him a more textured understanding of when violence might be necessary. Throughout later seasons, we see Morty struggle with this knowledge, sometimes embracing the pragmatic approach Rick embodies, other times resisting it and trying to find more compassionate solutions. This internal conflict becomes a central aspect of Morty's character development, the tension between the innocent boy he once was and the complicated person he's becoming. From a developmental psychology perspective, Morty's evolution mirrors the typical moral development of adolescents as they move from rigid, black-and-white moral thinking toward more contextual understanding. However, Morty's experiences accelerate and intensify this process, forcing him to confront moral dilemmas that most teenagers never face. The weight of these decisions creates a unique psychological burden. Morty gains wisdom beyond his years, but at the cost of the innocence that might have protected him from existential dread. As the series progresses, Morty's moral compass continues to evolve. He becomes more comfortable with moral ambiguity, more willing to make difficult choices when necessary. Yet he never fully embraces Rick's nihilistic worldview. Instead, Morty develops his own moral framework, one that acknowledges the complexity of the multiverse but still values life and connection when possible. It's this balance that distinguishes Morty's psychology from Rick's, suggesting that despite everything he's experienced, Morty has maintained a core of humanity that Rick may have lost long ago. That core of humanity Morty maintains doesn't come without a price. Hidden away in a secret room in Rick's garage, sits a collection of glowing vials, each containing a memory Morty found too traumatic to keep. While we've witnessed Morty endure countless horrifying adventures, Morty's Mind Blowers reveals an entirely different dimension to his psychology, the experiences he actively chooses to forget rather than integrate into his identity. Unlike the memories Morty carries with him, these removed experiences represent his breaking points, moments where the psychological burden became too overwhelming to process. What's particularly fascinating is the pattern behind what Morty chooses to erase versus what he's willing to endure. The memories that remain in his consciousness often involve physical danger, cosmic horrors, or even moral compromises. But the ones he erases, these touch something far more personal and devastating. Take, for instance, the memory where Morty misunderstands an alien language and inadvertently causes an innocent being's death. This wasn't a heat-of-the-moment decision or a necessary evil to save others. It was a simple linguistic mistake with catastrophic consequences. The guilt Morty feels isn't about making a difficult choice. It's about making a mundane error that costs someone their life. This type of guilt proves more unbearable to him than the weight of his calculated moral choices. Even more revealing is the memory involving the sentient telescope. This seemingly innocuous device showed Morty exactly how he would die. A glimpse into his inevitable future that proved too existentially devastating to retain. While Morty regularly faces death across dimensions, knowing the specific circumstances of his own mortality crossed a psychological threshold he couldn't accommodate. This suggests that Morty can handle the abstract concept of death, but the concrete certainty of his own end is a different kind of terror altogether. Perhaps most psychologically significant is the memory where Morty discovers his family would be happier in a reality where he doesn't exist. This strikes at the core of his deepest fear, not just being replaceable in the multiverse, which he's already been forced to confront, but being a net negative in the lives of those he cares about. While Morty has adapted to cosmic horrors, the idea that his very existence might harm his loved ones represents a form of emotional trauma he simply couldn't process. What we're witnessing through these erased memories is Morty constructing his own unique form of psychological defense. In clinical terms, he's essentially outsourcing dissociation, the psychological defense mechanism where people separate themselves from painful experiences. But rather than this separation happening internally through natural psychological processes, Morty has access to technology that makes it literal and complete. This technological form of memory repression raises fascinating questions about psychological development. Memory repression can serve as both a protective and potentially harmful mechanism. While it prevents immediate emotional distress, it may also interfere with the development of healthy coping mechanisms. Morty is essentially creating gaps in his own psychological narrative, blank spaces where formative experiences should exist. The irony is that by removing these memories, Morty might be hampering his own emotional growth. The process of working through trauma, while painful, typically leads to greater psychological resilience. By erasing rather than processing these experiences, Morty may be preventing himself from developing the very coping skills that would help him handle similar situations in the future. This creates a potentially dangerous cycle where his threshold for what constitutes unbearable might actually lower over time, rather than strengthening through exposure and integration. What's particularly telling is the sheer volume of these memories. The collection of mind blowers suggests Morty has experienced far more trauma than what we see in the regular episodes. Each glowing vial represents a moment where Morty reached his psychological limit, and the fact that there are so many implies just how frequently he encounters experiences that exceed his capacity to cope. This highlights the cumulative toll of his adventures with Rick, suggesting that beneath his growing resilience lies a foundation of experiences so devastating that forgetting became his only option. This system of memory removal also reveals something profound about Morty's relationship with Rick. By creating and maintaining this collection, Rick is simultaneously enabling Morty's unhealthy coping mechanism while also acknowledging his grandson's psychological limitations. There's an unusual tenderness in the fact that Rick doesn't force Morty to endure every traumatic experience. He recognizes when something is truly too much and provides a technological escape hatch. It's manipulation and protection intertwined in a way that perfectly captures their dysfunctional relationship dynamic. The Mind Blowers also reveal a concerning aspect of Morty's development. He's becoming increasingly comfortable with editing his own reality rather than confronting difficult truths. This mirrors Rick's own approach to existence, suggesting that despite maintaining his moral compass, Morty is adopting some of Rick's more problematic coping strategies. The ease with which Morty requests memory removal implies he's beginning to see his own consciousness as something malleable rather than continuous, a perspective that aligns more with Rick's nihilistic worldview than with Morty's previously grounded sense of self. From a psychological standpoint, this form of selective memory manipulation raises questions about identity formation. Who are we if not the sum of our experiences, both good and traumatic? By removing specific memories, Morty is essentially curating his own psychological narrative, creating a version of himself unburdened by certain traumas, but also potentially incomplete. The experiences we endure, particularly during adolescence, play a crucial role in identity development. By erasing portions of his past, Morty might be creating fractures in his sense of self that could manifest in unexpected ways. Beyond all the memories Morty chooses to erase, lies the one that fundamentally shattered his reality, abandoning his Cronenberg dimension and replacing a dead version of himself. The psychological impact of this single event runs deeper than any other trauma Morty experiences, creating an existential wound that no mind-blowing technology can heal. In Rick Potion Nor 9, we witness what might be the most profound psychological turning point in Morty's development. After Rick's love potion catastrophically backfires, transforming nearly everyone on Earth into grotesque Cronenberg monsters, Rick's solution isn't to fix their reality, it's to abandon it entirely. Rick locates a nearly identical dimension where that version of Rick and Morty solve the Cronenberg problem but die immediately afterward in a lab accident. The scene that follows, Rick and Morty burying their own corpses in the backyard, serves as a visual metaphor for Morty's shattered sense of identity. What makes this moment so psychologically significant is that Morty doesn't just witness death or destruction, he participates in a cosmic identity theft. He's forced to literally step into a dead version of himself's life, continuing as if nothing happened while knowing his original family remains in a monster-filled wasteland. The immediate psychological impact manifests in what animation experts identify as Morty's thousand-yard stare, a blank, distant gaze that appears immediately after the burial scene. This visual cue isn't just artistic choice, it's a deliberate representation of dissociation, a common response to overwhelming trauma. The thousand-yard stare becomes more than a momentary reaction. It marks a fundamental shift in how Morty views himself and his place in the multiverse. Before this event, Morty struggled with typical teenage insecurity. After burying himself, he confronts an existential truth far more devastating. He's fundamentally replaceable. In a multiverse of infinite Mortys, his individual identity becomes both meaningless and fluid. He's no longer just Morty Smith from Earth. He's a Morty who replaced another Morty, living in a reality that isn't originally his. This realization of replaceability strikes at the core of Morty's self-worth in ways that even Rick's casual dismissals never could. When teenagers typically struggle with questions of identity and belonging, these concerns usually remain grounded in a stable reality. Morty's identity crisis transcends normal adolescent development. How can you know who you are when the very foundation of your reality has proven to be impermanent? What's particularly notable about the Cronenberg incident is that unlike other traumatic experiences, Morty continues to reference it in later episodes. This ongoing acknowledgement suggests the trauma remains active and unresolved. While Morty chooses to erase other painful memories, this foundational fracture in his identity persists. It becomes a psychological reference point that he carries forward, indicating its significance in shaping his worldview. The psychological aftermath of dimensional displacement manifests in Morty's behavior through increased risk-taking. After witnessing the disposability of entire realities, Morty's fear response shifts. If realities can be discarded and identities replaced, what truly matters? This understanding fuels a growing nihilistic streak that occasionally mirrors Rick's own philosophical position. The difference, however, is that Morty hasn't fully surrendered to nihilism. He still struggles against it, trying to maintain some semblance of meaning in a multiverse that constantly undermines the concept. Psychologically, this experience creates what experts might call an adaptive dissociation. Teenagers typically process grief and displacement through various coping mechanisms, including avoidance and denial. Morty takes this further by compartmentalizing his cosmic trauma while simultaneously trying to maintain normal teenage experiences. School, crushes, and family dynamics become anchors to reality. Imperfect attempts to preserve a cohesive identity amid existential fracturing. What's fascinating about Morty's response to dimensional displacement is how it shapes his future relationship with mortality and identity. His awareness of infinite dimensions populated with countless versions of himself creates a paradoxical relationship with death. On one hand, death loses some of its finality. There's always another Morty somewhere. On the other hand, the unique experiences that shape his specific consciousness become the only true marker of his identity, making their potential loss even more significant. The creators of Rick and Morty have emphasized the importance of the Cronenberg episode precisely because it establishes this existential framework. It sets the stage for Morty's ongoing crises and fundamentally alters the trajectory of his relationship with Rick. After burying himself, Morty can never fully trust Rick's solutions because he's witnessed the ultimate cost of Rick's cavalier approach to fixing problems. This event also creates a unique form of survivor's guilt. Morty lives with the knowledge that he abandoned his original family to their monster-filled fate. At the same time, he's an imposter in his new reality, occupying a space that belonged to another version of himself. This dual psychological burden informs his interactions with his new family, creating subtle distancing mechanisms as he tries to reconcile these complicated emotions. Morty's psychological adaptation to this trauma reveals surprising resilience. Rather than complete psychological collapse, he develops a remarkable ability to function within this fractured framework. This adaptation manifests in his increased comfort with multiversal concepts in later episodes and his ability to navigate increasingly complex ethical dilemmas. The Cronenberg incident forces Morty to develop psychological tools most teenagers never need: the capacity to question the nature of reality itself. The fundamental question arising from Morty's dimensional displacement is how he balances his teenage identity with his interdimensional experiences. The answer lies in his compartmentalization skills. Morty creates psychological barriers between his cosmic awareness and his day-to-day life. He still pursues crushes, worries about school, and engages in typical teenage activities, but these now serve a different psychological function. Rather than being the central concerns of his existence, they become anchors to normality, touchstones that prevent complete dissociation. Those anchors to normality Morty clings to aren't just activities, they're people. His family relationships form an essential psychological safety net that's rarely examined but critically important to his mental health. While Rick's cosmic chaos threatens to overwhelm Morty's sense of self, his connections with Summer, Beth, and even Jerry create a complex web of relationships that both wound and heal him in ways that his interdimensional adventures never could. Family relationships are particularly significant during adolescence, and despite the extraordinary circumstances of Morty's life, he's still fundamentally a teenager navigating family dynamics. What makes these relationships fascinating is how they evolve as more Smith family members become aware of the multiverse. As Summer joins the Cosmic Awareness Club, her relationship with Morty transforms from typical sibling rivalry into something far more complex and emotionally significant. When Morty first introduces Summer to the multiverse, we see a protective side emerge that contrasts sharply with their earlier competitive dynamic. There's a telling shift in Morty's demeanor. He positions himself as the experienced guide, the knowledgeable one who can help Summer navigate this new reality. This rare opportunity to demonstrate competence gives Morty something he desperately lacks in most other areas of his life: confidence and authority. For a teenager usually defined by his insecurities, these moments with Summer provide crucial validation. "You're too young to understand, Summer," Morty often says, but beneath this superficial superiority lies a genuine concern for his sister's psychological well-being. He's witnessed the horrors of the cosmos firsthand and understands how easily one's sense of reality can shatter. His protective instincts towards Summer reveal a depth of empathy that Rick actively discourages. It's as if Morty is trying to shield Summer from experiencing the same psychological fractures he's endured. This protective relationship goes both ways, though. Summer eventually becomes one of the few people who truly understand what Morty experiences on a daily basis. When they share cosmic adventures, they develop a unique bond that helps Morty process his experiences through shared understanding rather than isolation. This sibling alliance creates a psychological buffer against Rick's more nihilistic influence. Morty's relationship with his father Jerry is equally complex but in entirely different ways. On the surface, we see Morty's frequent embarrassment by Jerry's incompetence and naivety, typical teenage mortification amplified by cosmic awareness. Yet beneath this embarrassment lies a protective instinct that becomes increasingly evident as the series progresses. Morty often finds himself caught between Rick's open contempt for Jerry and his own complicated feelings for his father. What's psychologically significant is how Morty recognizes patterns in Jerry that he fears in himself: insecurity, social awkwardness, and a desperate need for validation. These similarities create an uncomfortable mirror for Morty, yet simultaneously foster a hidden empathy. We see this when Morty defends Jerry against Rick's cruelest dismissals, or when he makes efforts to protect Jerry from cosmic threats he knows his father couldn't handle. Perhaps most revealing is Morty's relationship with his mother, Beth. Family systems theory suggests that mother-child relationships significantly influence psychological development, and Morty's interactions with Beth showcase a pattern of emotional neglect. That has shaped his coping mechanisms. Beth's preoccupation with her own relationship with Rick often leaves Morty emotionally unsupported, creating a foundation of insecurity that permeates his character. Morty's understanding of abandonment issues runs deeper than most teenagers. He recognizes Beth's desperate need for Rick's approval because it mirrors his own complex feelings toward his grandfather. This shared psychological pattern creates moments of unexpected connection between mother and son, where Morty demonstrates a startling emotional maturity in his understanding of Beth's vulnerabilities. What's remarkable about these family dynamics is how they simultaneously create stability and stress in Morty's life. The Smith family's dysfunction adds layers of anxiety to Morty's already overwhelming cosmic experiences. Yet paradoxically, these flawed family bonds also provide crucial emotional anchoring points that prevent complete psychological dissociation. When Morty returns from witnessing the horrors of the universe, the predictable patterns of family life, even dysfunctional ones, help reestablish a sense of normalcy. These family relationships serve another critical psychological function. They humanize Morty in ways that his adventures with Rick actively threaten. Rick consistently pushes a nihilistic worldview where nothing matters in an infinite multiverse. But Morty's continued emotional investment in his family, his concern for Summer's safety, his complicated empathy for Jerry, his desire for Beth's attention, represents an implicit rejection of Rick's philosophy. These connections matter to Morty, suggesting that even in an infinite cosmos, individual relationships retain meaning. From a developmental perspective, Morty's family relationships provide opportunities for identity formation separate from his role as Rick's sidekick. With Summer, he can be the experienced guide. With Jerry, he can express aspects of competence his father lacks. With Beth, he navigates complex emotional territories that build emotional intelligence. Each relationship offers Morty different ways of understanding himself beyond the narrow confines of cosmic terror. This network of family relationships creates a psychological support system that serves as a counterbalance to Rick's influence. Without these connections, Morty might easily succumb to the same nihilistic worldview that characterizes his grandfather. The fact that he maintains emotional investments despite knowing the meaninglessness of existence in an infinite multiverse speaks to the psychological resilience these relationships foster. Perhaps most significantly, Morty's family connections provide something essential that adventures with Rick cannot: unconditional acceptance. Despite their dysfunction, the Smith family accepts Morty as he is, not for his usefulness on adventures or his compliance with cosmic schemes, but simply for being himself. This basic acceptance functions as a psychological anchor that keeps Morty from drifting entirely into Rick's nihilistic worldview. When we examine the full psychological picture of Morty Smith, his family relationships emerge as crucial stabilizing forces in a life dominated by cosmic chaos. They represent both his greatest vulnerability and his greatest strength. The emotional connections that cause him pain are also the ones that prevent him from becoming just another Rick, detached from humanity and consumed by cynicism. In a universe of infinite possibilities, it's Morty's ordinary family bonds that make him extraordinarily resilient. Evil Morty stands as the ultimate psychological shadow that our Morty can't escape. When we think about the multiverse theory at the heart of Rick and Morty, we're forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. If infinite possibilities exist, then somewhere out there is the worst version of ourselves. For Morty Smith, that nightmare has a name, a face, and a terrifying plan. The concept of the shadow self is particularly relevant when examining Evil Morty's psychological significance. In psychological terms, the shadow represents the unconscious part of our personality containing repressed weaknesses, desires, and instincts. Evil Morty embodies everything our Morty fears he might become if he fully embraced Rick's nihilistic worldview and abandoned his moral compass. This isn't just another antagonist. It's Morty without restraint, Morty without family anchors, Morty who has fully processed his trauma and emerged not stronger but colder. In Rick Mirai Jack, we see this realized version who has discarded ethical limitations entirely, showcasing the darkness that potentially resides within our protagonist. The episode presents a chilling vision of what happens when a Morty stops resisting the universe's cruelty and instead harnesses it. What makes Evil Morty such a compelling psychological mirror is that he maintains all of Morty's intelligence and adaptability, but lacks the moral boundaries. Our Morty's reactions to encountering this alternative version reveal deep-seated anxieties about his own potential. The fear isn't simply about facing a powerful enemy. It's the fear of recognition, of seeing familiar thought patterns and capabilities twisted into something monstrous. The psychological impact goes beyond simple villain dynamics. When our Morty learns about Evil Morty's elaborate plans and his ability to outsmart countless Ricks, there's a mixture of horror and uncomfortable recognition. Both versions share the same foundation. They're intelligent characters capable of complex planning when properly motivated. The main difference lies not in their abilities but in their choices and moral frameworks. We see glimpses of potential darkness in our Morty throughout the series. Moments when he manipulates others, when he makes coldly rational decisions, or when he betrays Rick's trust for his own purposes. All these hint at capabilities that, if taken to their logical extreme without moral restraint, could create someone like Evil Morty. These similarities aren't coincidental. They're deliberately established to blur the line between hero and villain. The struggles our Morty faces internally become externalized through Evil Morty's existence. The constant tension between embracing Rick's amoral approach to the universe and maintaining his humanity finds physical form in this alternate self. Every time Morty compromises his values for convenience or survival, he takes a small step toward becoming what he fears most. This creates a fascinating psychological dynamic, where Morty is essentially racing against his own potential corruption. Consider how this knowledge affects Morty's decision-making in later seasons. After becoming aware of Evil Morty, our Morty seems to occasionally pause during morally ambiguous situations, as if considering the long-term psychological implications of his choices. The awareness that he could become something he despises creates a new dimension of self-reflection that wasn't present in earlier seasons. Creator commentary supports this interpretation, noting that Evil Morty was specifically designed to challenge the audience's perception of Morty's character. By forcing viewers to confront the darker aspects of his personality, the show raises questions about the consequences of the choices our protagonist makes throughout the series. Each compromise, each trauma not properly processed, each moral boundary crossed, all potentially steps toward becoming Evil Morty. This mirror relationship fits within broader psychological theories about identity formation. During adolescence, when identity is particularly malleable, individuals often define themselves partly by what they reject. Our Morty actively rejects the path Evil Morty represents, using this shadow version as a psychological boundary marker for his own identity. In essence, Evil Morty helps our Morty define himself by showing what he refuses to become. The psychological impact of this relationship extends beyond Morty's internal world. In the narrative, Evil Morty's actions serve as catalysts for self-reflection and moral reaffirmation. After encounters with this darker self, our Morty often recommits to his values and makes choices that reinforce his humanity, actively pushing against the nihilistic current that Evil Morty represents. What truly sets our Morty apart from Evil Morty psychologically is not intelligence or capability, but resilience of a different kind. While Evil Morty demonstrates resilience through abandoning emotional attachments and ethical constraints, our Morty finds strength in maintaining his moral core despite trauma. He continues to form connections, show empathy, and search for meaning in a universe that repeatedly suggests such efforts are futile. Fan theories propose that this fundamental difference stems from the presence of family bonds in our Morty's life. While we know little about Evil Morty's background, the implication is that he either lost these connections or chose to sever them. Our Morty, despite all his cosmic trauma, remains tethered to humanity through his relationships with Summer, Beth, and even Jerry. These connections, however dysfunctional, provide emotional anchoring that Evil Morty apparently lacks. This creates a fascinating psychological proposition. Perhaps the true battle isn't between good and evil, but between connection and isolation. Evil Morty represents the endpoint of isolation. Brilliant, independent, but fundamentally disconnected from the emotional experiences that make life meaningful. Our Morty, through maintaining relationships despite their complications, preserves something essential about his humanity. The struggle between good and evil within oneself emphasizes the importance of choice in shaping destiny. Our Morty repeatedly chooses connection over isolation, empathy over emotional detachment, and moral consideration over pure pragmatism. These choices, more than any inherent difference, distinguish him from his evil counterpart. The psychological tension created by Evil Morty's existence raises profound questions about nature versus nurture in the multiverse context. If all Mortys start with similar psychological foundations, what specific experiences or choices create such divergent outcomes? This reflection adds depth to our understanding of the protagonist's psychology, suggesting that he remains constantly at a crossroads between multiple potential versions of himself. Beyond the shadow of evil, Morty lies a different kind of evolution within our protagonist, one that happens in real time during life-threatening situations. Remember that screaming, panicking kid from Season 1? That version of Morty is disappearing with each adventure, replaced by someone who can analyze threats with surprising clarity while bullets are flying past his head. When we look at Morty's journey through the lens of his fear response, we're actually watching one of the most realistic portrayals of psychological adaptation in animated television. The transformation isn't just about character development. It's about the neurological rewiring that happens when a human brain repeatedly encounters extreme danger and somehow survives. In the early adventures, Morty's responses were textbook examples of basic fear reactions. His body would freeze, his voice would rise several octaves into that characteristic panicked scream, and his eyes would widen to the point where they seemed to take up half his face. This wasn't just animation exaggeration. It was an accurate portrayal of how a teenager would physically respond to cosmic horrors that defy comprehension. What's fascinating is how this response pattern begins to change over time. Rather than becoming desensitized, which would suggest emotional numbness, Morty instead develops new neural pathways. His brain literally begins to process danger differently, treating it as a problem to be solved rather than a reason to panic. The Purge Planet episode offers a perfect example of this evolution. When confronted with imminent violence, instead of freezing or waiting for Rick to save him, Morty manipulates the planet's natives with a strategic understanding of their culture and psychology. He's not just reacting anymore. He's planning, adapting, and even anticipating how threats might unfold before they happen. This transformation reflects a real psychological process called stress inoculation. Through repeated exposure to threatening situations, in Morty's case, absurdly dangerous ones, the brain essentially builds new neural architecture. The amygdala, the part responsible for that initial fear response, doesn't stop functioning, but its signals get processed differently by the prefrontal cortex, allowing for more complex thinking even in high-stress moments. We see this process unfold literally in real time across episodes. During tense situations, the camera often focuses on Morty's face, and we can see the exact moment when the initial panic subsides and a calculating look replaces it. His features settle, his breathing steadies, and his eyes narrow slightly as he begins to assess the situation. These subtle animation cues signal a profound internal shift from reactive fear to tactical assessment. As this transformation occurs, Rick's attitude toward Morty undergoes its own evolution. In early episodes, Rick would dismissively wait out Morty's panic attacks before taking charge. But gradually, we notice Rick giving Morty more space to handle situations, sometimes even stepping back entirely. This isn't just character development, it's Rick acknowledging Morty's growing competence, a crucial external validation that reinforces Morty's internal changes. The episodes where Morty functions effectively without Rick provide the clearest evidence of this internalized adaptation. When separated from his grandfather, early seasons Morty would typically hide or seek the quickest escape. But as the series progresses, solo Morty demonstrates an increasing ability to navigate complex threats using skills and approaches he's absorbed from his adventures. He doesn't just survive these situations, he strategizes through them, applying lessons from past experiences in new contexts. What makes this evolution particularly remarkable is that Morty doesn't lose his capacity for fear. He still experiences the emotion, but now it serves as information rather than overwhelming his entire system. This represents a sophisticated understanding of fear psychology. True courage isn't the absence of fear, but the ability to function effectively despite it. The relationship between Rick and Morty transforms alongside this psychological evolution. Where once it was strictly hierarchical, the genius leader and his panicking sidekick, it gradually shifts towards something more collaborative. Rick still leads most adventures, but he increasingly treats Morty as a partner with valuable skills rather than baggage to be protected. We see more moments of genuine teamwork where they anticipate each other's actions without explicit communication, a far cry from the constant directives Rick would shout at a frozen Morty in early episodes. This shift creates a fascinating feedback loop. As Rick acknowledges Morty's growing competence, Morty gains confidence, which further enhances his ability to think strategically in dangerous situations. The dynamic becomes self-reinforcing, accelerating Morty's development from terrified teenager to capable survivor. Psychologically speaking, this represents a form of post-traumatic growth, the positive psychological changes that can occur following highly challenging life circumstances. While Morty certainly carries trauma from his adventures, he's also developed remarkable resilience and practical wisdom. The kid who once couldn't handle an alien sneeze without screaming now calmly negotiates with cosmic entities and outsmarts beings with intelligence far beyond human comprehension. The evolution in Morty's fear response also connects directly to his identity development. Each successful navigation of danger reinforces his self-concept as someone who is capable and resourceful. He's no longer just Rick's nervous grandson. He's developed skills and perspectives that are uniquely his own. This emerging identity allows him to maintain psychological coherence despite the chaos of the multiverse around him. What's particularly compelling about this aspect of Morty's character development is how it mirrors actual neurological processes that occur in humans who repeatedly experience danger. The brain physically rewires itself to process threats differently, creating new neural pathways that allow for more complex responses. Animation gives us a window into this internal process, showing us the external manifestations of Morty's changing neurology through his expressions, posture, and actions. As viewers, we sometimes forget just how many legitimately traumatic experiences Morty has survived. The cumulative effect of these experiences isn't just psychological but neurological. His brain has literally adapted to process danger differently than a normal teenager's would. This adaptation isn't merely a coping mechanism, but a sophisticated rewiring that transforms fear from a debilitating emotion into a strategic resource. The neurological adaptations Morty developed through countless life-threatening adventures prepared him for many things, but nothing could have prepared him for the vat of acid episode. What happens when the meaningful life you built across multiple timelines turns out to be nothing more than your grandfather's elaborate scheme for petty revenge? The premise of this episode centers around a seemingly simple disagreement. After Morty criticizes one of Rick's plans involving a fake vat of acid as an escape mechanism, Rick presents him with a device that appears to be a do-over button. This remote allows Morty to create save points in his timeline and return to them whenever he wants, essentially erasing any mistakes he makes. What Morty doesn't realize is that this device isn't creating save points at all. It's jumping him between alternate timelines while eliminating the versions of himself he leaves behind. At first, Morty uses this power for typical teenage impulses, stealing a TV, jumping off dangerous heights, and playing pranks on unsuspecting victims. This initial phase reveals something important about Morty's psychology. Beneath his anxieties lies a teenager seeking control in a chaotic life. The button represents something Morty has never had in his adventures with Rick: the power to erase consequences and shape his own destiny without fear of permanent damage. As the episode progresses, we witness a fascinating shift in how Morty uses this newfound power. After meeting a girl named Planetina during a plane crash, Morty begins using the reset button not for pranks or thrills, but to nurture a genuine romantic connection. We watch as Morty and Planetina develop a relationship across seasons, moving in together, adopting a dog, and building a life filled with small, meaningful moments. This relationship represents something truly significant in Morty's psychological development: his capacity for authentic human connection despite all the cosmic horrors he's witnessed. What makes this emotional arc so devastating is that just as Morty experiences perhaps his most authentic relationship, it's ripped away from him. After getting into trouble with the police, Morty uses his reset button one final time only to discover it no longer works. He's forced to actually face consequences, spending months in prison before finally being released and desperately searching for Planetina. When he finds her with no memory of their relationship, the psychological impact is crushing. He's experienced months of genuine connection that now exists only in his memory. But the true psychological test comes when Rick reveals the devastating truth. There was never any save point technology. The remote simply transported Morty to identical timelines while cleaning up the messes he left behind by killing those versions of himself. The montage showing the consequences of Morty's actions across multiple realities forces him to confront the ripple effects of his choices in a way he's never had to before. Each abandoned timeline represents a broken thread of existence, and the weight of this realization is written across Morty's face. The most psychologically significant moment comes when Morty learns the entire experience was orchestrated by Rick as punishment for questioning his vat of acid idea. This revelation transforms what seemed like a gift into perhaps the cruelest manipulation Rick has ever inflicted on his grandson. It's a perfect example of how their relationship combines moments of mentorship with profound emotional abuse. Rick didn't just want to prove Morty wrong. He wanted to break him psychologically by giving him the illusion of control before snatching it away. Morty's response to this revelation provides a window into his psychological resilience. His initial reaction is pure rage, throwing furniture and physically attacking Rick in a rare display of complete emotional breakdown. This moment represents a healthy psychological response to manipulation, a recognition of the violation he's experienced. But what follows is more complex and potentially troubling. A disturbing acceptance of his situation that suggests the psychological impact of living in an abusive relationship with Rick. When Rick offers Morty a choice, either wear a vat of acid costume and pretend to be dissolving in acid in front of a group of aliens, or refuse and keep his dignity, Morty chooses the humiliation. This choice reveals something profound about Morty's psychology at this point in the series. Despite his growing independence, there's a part of him that has internalized Rick's manipulative framework. He's learned to accept certain humiliations as the price of participating in Rick's world. Yet beneath this acceptance lies a strength, the ability to endure, to absorb emotional pain, and to continue functioning. What this episode ultimately reveals about Morty is his extraordinary capacity for psychological processing. Consider the magnitude of what he experiences. He lives months, perhaps years, of authentic life with Planetina, discovers this relationship was essentially stolen from him, learns that hundreds of versions of himself were killed to maintain his illusion of control, and finally realizes it was all an elaborate punishment from his grandfather. The psychological burden of these revelations would shatter most people, yet Morty absorbs this trauma and continues. This resilience isn't merely a coping mechanism, but a sophisticated psychological adaptation. Morty has developed the ability to compartmentalize trauma, to process extreme emotional pain, and to maintain his core identity despite repeated violations of his trust and autonomy. This doesn't mean he escapes unscathed. Each manipulation adds another layer to his complex psychological profile, but it demonstrates a remarkable capacity for endurance. The Vat of Acid episode also reveals something about Morty's evolving value system. Despite everything Rick takes from him, Morty still values human connection. His relationship with Planetina wasn't just a teenage romance. It represented a meaningful life built on small moments of connection and routine. That Morty could still invest so fully in this relationship after all he's experienced speaks to his refusal to surrender to the nihilism that defines Rick's worldview. That refusal to surrender to nihilism planted a seed that would grow into something Rick never anticipated: a grandson capable of genuine resistance. The most compelling evidence of Morty's psychological evolution isn't found in what he's willing to do for Rick anymore, but in what he's finally brave enough to refuse. Look at Morty's physical transformation across the series. The animation style deliberately shows his growth from a hunched, trembling sidekick into someone who stands taller, moves with more confidence, and most importantly, can look Rick directly in the eyes when saying no. This evolution of body language isn't just artistic choice. It's a deliberate visual representation of Morty's growing psychological independence. In the Rick-Lantis mix-up, we see one of the first significant instances where Morty actively challenges Rick's decisions and expresses his own opinions without the stuttering hesitation that once defined his character. The animation emphasizes his more assertive posture, creating a stark visual contrast with the Morty we met in earlier seasons. His stance is more grounded, his gestures more decisive, and his eye contact unwavering. All subtle yet powerful indicators of his psychological development and growing self-respect. This gradual transformation didn't happen overnight. Each instance where Morty sets a boundary with Rick represents a significant psychological victory. When he articulates his values in Morty's Mindblowers, specifically expressing his desire for autonomy and the importance of making his own choices, he's not just complaining. He's actively engaging in the individuation process essential for healthy psychological development. What's fascinating about Morty's journey toward independence is how he learns to apply Rick's own tactics selectively without abandoning his core values. He's figured out how to navigate Rick's world while maintaining the parts of himself that make him distinctly Morty. This selective adaptation demonstrates remarkable psychological flexibility. He can utilize Rick's approach to problem-solving without succumbing to Rick's nihilistic worldview. The animation style in later seasons emphasizes this growing independence through more dynamic and confident postures. Notice how in early episodes Morty was frequently animated with hunched shoulders, constantly looking up at Rick. In contrast, more recent episodes show him standing his ground, both literally and figuratively. These visual cues reflect his psychological development and increased self-respect, communicating his evolution without requiring explicit dialogue. In Rick and Morty, the Vat of Acid episode, we see Morty taking the lead in situations Rick would typically control. This wasn't just Morty being impulsive. It demonstrated his growth from an anxious sidekick to a more capable partner. Throughout this episode, Morty's animation portrays him with increased confidence in his movements and decision-making, visually reinforcing his psychological evolution. What's particularly significant about Morty's journey is that he's not just mimicking Rick's behavior. He's developing his own distinct approach to navigating the multiverse. While Rick's methodology often relies on emotional detachment and treating others as disposable, Morty consistently chooses connection and empathy, even when making tough decisions. This represents the emergence of a truly independent psychological framework, not just rebellion against Rick's authority. The series creators have highlighted this evolution, noting that Morty has transitioned from being a passive participant in Rick's adventures to actively pursuing his own agenda. This reflects a significant psychological shift from external motivation, doing what Rick wants, to internal motivation, acting on his own values and desires. It's the difference between a child who obeys out of fear and a young adult who makes choices based on their own moral compass. Morty's growing assertiveness isn't limited to verbal defiance. It extends to taking direct action contrary to Rick's instructions. While early season Morty would rarely defy Rick's direct orders, later seasons show him consistently making independent choices, even when they directly contradict what Rick wants. This behavioral shift reflects deeper psychological development and growing confidence in his own judgment. The animation subtly reinforces this through more assertive body language and facial expressions. Early Morty was animated with wide, frightened eyes and constant nervous movements. Later, Morty is depicted with more controlled expressions and purposeful movements, visually communicating his psychological maturation. One of the most powerful examples of Morty's psychological independence comes when he breaks free from codependent dynamics with Rick. The creators have emphasized that Morty's journey is about finding self-identity and personal agency. We can track this development through his gradually changing responses to Rick's manipulation, from complete compliance to questioning, and finally, to outright refusal. Morty's relationship with Rick has evolved from pure dependence to something closer to interdependence. While he still values Rick's knowledge and abilities, he no longer defines himself entirely through this relationship. This psychological shift is crucial for healthy development. Morty has learned to see himself as a separate individual with inherent worth, not just as Rick's sidekick or tool. This doesn't mean their relationship has deteriorated. In many ways, it's become more authentic. When Morty chooses to accompany Rick on adventures now, it's not out of fear or manipulation, but because he's making a conscious choice. This represents a more psychologically healthy dynamic, where both parties retain their autonomy while choosing to collaborate. The animation style emphasizes this shift through more equal positioning in frame compositions. Early episodes frequently positioned Rick physically above Morty, reinforcing the power dynamic. Later episodes often show them at similar eye levels, or even with Morty positioned prominently in the foreground, visually signaling his growing importance and agency. Perhaps the most profound aspect of Morty's psychological development is that he's learned to be selective about when to follow Rick and when to chart his own course. This nuanced approach demonstrates sophisticated psychological maturity. He can acknowledge Rick's expertise without surrendering his autonomy. It's the difference between blind obedience and informed collaboration. What's truly remarkable about Morty Smith's psychological evolution is how authentically it mirrors actual trauma response. We've watched him transform from that stuttering, anxious kid into someone who can face cosmic horrors while somehow keeping his fundamental self intact. One of the most powerful illustrations of this comes in Rick Potion number 9. 9 inches when Morty has to confront the consequences of his actions, burying his own alternate self while processing the abandonment of his original reality. Yet, through all these existential nightmares, Morty hasn't surrendered his core identity. He continues seeking meaningful connections with others, standing up for his principles, and maintaining hope in a universe that constantly demonstrates how meaningless hope should be. This represents perhaps the most significant contrast between Morty and Rick. While Rick has allowed his trauma to isolate him from genuine connection, Morty refuses to give up on humanity. In the endless cosmic chaos they navigate, Morty's persistent empathy might be his greatest psychological strength and the true measure of his resilience.